Our next speaker is James Thomas. He's the Enterprise Architecture Lead at the South African Reserve Bank. James has a broad experience in the information technology environment with over 30 years in the field. James also has experience in business management, sales and project management, and has interfaced extensively with senior and executive management of various medium to large enterprises in South Africa, the African continent, and internationally. Roles span a broad range from a technical specialist through pre-sales engineering, solution design, solution architecture, training and lecturing, security architect, enterprise architect, business architect, to team lead, manager, and director. Clearly a good all-rounder. Formal qualifications in business management and project management with many certifications, including TOGAF and Archimate. Over to you, James.
Well, good day. I have the honor of speaking to you about what we're doing at the South African Reserve Bank in what we call city planning. It's an analogy we're using to ensure that we align with business and IT. And generally speaking, every industry developed their own jargon, lots of terms and definitions and abbreviations unique to that specific community. And to facilitate the business and IT integration at the Reserve Bank, we decided to use an analogy of city planning to get the message across, both to our colleagues on the IT side, but even more so to our colleagues on the business end. And I'd like to take you through how we've defined that, to explain what the key components are of enterprise architecture at the bank. And perhaps you could then identify opportunities to reuse or to even extend, and we would welcome any feedback that you may have as well. So I'd like to take you through the city plan of the South African Reserve Bank. We'll be looking at just an overview and some context. I will then take you through the elements and components of the city plan and give you some examples of what we are doing in that space. Key elements that we'd like to address: the context. How do these elements of the city plan fit together? Potentially some new insights on partitioning and zoning models that we have incorporated, and how we're applying those concepts. Just before I start, some contextual overview of enterprise architecture at the bank. Our entire scope of work spans all the way from strategic alignment through domain architectures right down to solution architectures. So we have the enterprise architecture team divided into sub-teams. Some of our domain architects focus really on the baselines and the reference material, some of which I'll elaborate on as part of the city plan. We have our enterprise and portfolio architects who focus on the strategic intent, the long-term perspective. And then we have solution architects focused on key programs and projects at a solution or capability level. They all, to some extent, relate to the city planning paradigm, but of course, city planning is focused more towards enterprise and domain architects, setting the scene overarching, whereas our solution architects would be more analogous to a building architect, whether it's a house, a school, an office building, or a mall. And they would need to reference the enterprise material. They would need to figure out how to connect to the core infrastructure of the city. They may have to comply to building standards and codes, which we develop from an enterprise architecture perspective. And they would have to apply similar concepts of understanding how to plan for growth and expansion, ensure that they meet their stakeholder objectives and expectations, how to ensure that the layout of connections for, if I'm continuing this analogy, water and electricity, is most suitably arranged within a building. Similarly, at a city plan level, we need to provide that for the entire enterprise across the city, and they would need to be able to connect to that core infrastructure across the city. So solution architects apply the same architecture concepts and principles, but it's focused on a different scope of work, more specialized, more specific, as an architect of a house or a building or a mall would be more specific than the city planners. So the city plan concept, what it allows us to do is really provide us with a continuously evolving perspective of the South African Reserve Bank's application and technology landscape, our business landscape. It establishes a common point of reference for the target environment that we're moving towards. And it provides a holistic perspective across the entire landscape. It's a city or urban plan around the business units, the initiatives, the projects we run, the timelines for those initiatives, the types of applications and technologies that we need to enable the business to evolve. It allows us to identify certain gaps and challenges in our environment. So where are the bottlenecks or the gaps, the challenges, the choke points, or opportunities as well. And it allows us to have a coherent and a consistent approach towards selecting components and solutions, and really allows us more rapid and aligned decision making, both for technology decisions but also business decisions. So the urban or city planning metaphor or analogy that we came up, really because it's easy for most people to understand and appreciate, regardless of where you live in the world or in a country, you would have a sense of the span of a city and everything that needs to be arranged and planned. And our cities evolve over time. Typically, there's a lot of unseen things going on, but when we call it out, one can appreciate those things and how they work. The elements that we've settled on in describing the city plan metaphor analogy include the purpose of the city, so the mandate and strategy and the purpose of a specific business or enterprise, the city plan itself or its vision, the roadmap, where does it want to go, the zoning plan for where certain developments should take place and what the parameters or the guidelines or rules are for development in that space, building codes, so the best way to define or develop or implement certain infrastructures, and approved building material lists or standards and guidelines. So delving a little more into the detail, the purpose of the city plan, cities exist for many reasons. They may have ports, farming opportunities, mining, industrial or financial hubs, and over time that reason could change. The agricultural environment might change, new discoveries could be made, the urbanization could change the nature of the city and its original purpose and function, and likewise any business could change over time. So at the South African Reserve Bank, since we're not a commercial enterprise, our mandate and our strategy really encapsulate the purpose of the city. So why do we exist? And we need to produce traceability between that mandate and strategy and the elements of the landscape of that city. So the enterprise architecture really needs to define what is required to support and realize the mandate, execute on the strategy, mostly linked through the business capabilities that we require to achieve our goals. The city plan, analogous to the leadership and community representatives within a city, defining a vision for the evolution of the city. Where do they want to go? How do they want to change things? Maybe clean up the inner city or expand more into extra areas outside of the traditional boundaries of the city to create more green space. And that plan and vision then needs to have actionable strategies and initiatives to be executed to realize that strategy. So in the same way that we have that overarching vision for the future, becoming a financial or industrial hub to achieve that outcome, at the bank, we would have the mandate, the business and technology strategies and various elements of the architecture landscape that need to evolve towards a certain stated objective and direction. And we then define the roadmap for those moving parts in a consistent way packaged into work packages, whether you execute in a waterfall or an agile method with the epics and features defined up front for the direction. The next major element is what we refer to as the zoning plan or the zoning model, and it really defines the guidelines for the city's evolution. It identifies certain areas for potentially, let's say, residential use, retail use, or industrial use, or parkland or green areas. And similarly, the equivalent zone plan in enterprise architecture is a typical partitioning model used to cut down the big city into bite-sized chunks, and a new concept we've introduced around operating quadrants associated with principles and guidelines that direct the evolution per zone. So as an example, in communities, a single family dwelling may have some variation. Not every house or home looks exactly the same, but they would comply to broader definitions for a single family home. One wouldn't see a 10-story building and refer to it as a single family home. So similarly, the SARB zones for enterprise architecture would cater for various levels of differentiation or uniformity depending on the characteristics of the specific zone. And the business capabilities, processes, the information, the applications and technology associated with that zone would be determined according to the rules depending on the coordination, unification, replication or differentiation standards that we've set. And that needs to be balanced with the individual business needs and the constraints and opportunities across the entire enterprise. And that's why it's quite an important element of our city plan model. The last two pieces, building code specifies the building standards that are important to the community, and it breaks them down into different areas. So in a typical city, you may have the fire code, the electrical code, the plumbing code, that set certain standards for when a home, an office building or a mall gets built, but also how to connect to the core infrastructure for those utilities that is provided by the city. So at the South African Reserve Bank, our enterprise architects capture and maintain a set of building codes which define the common building blocks and patterns for the various types of buildings or common infrastructure. And the building code document or reference architectures which we define contain the principles, the patterns, the guidelines for building blocks or components, and the key subjects areas for things like enterprise integration or business intelligence and analytics or cloud-based infrastructure. These reference architectures allow more rapid delivery because we've set the standards. So new services that make use of the building code and can be more rapidly be deployed, and they would also be compliant with the best practices that we've established and ensure alignment across the city. The building material list, the last component, is really a set of approved materials for the builders. It's formally approved and it sets standards for the material used in constructing new buildings of various types. In the SARB city plan, the standards for hardware or software or for configurations or data standards, master data, information or processes, preferred ways of doing things are used to guide the architecting of standards, standardized business and information technology solutions in the enterprise. So they could be externally defined, things that we need to conform to ensure interoperability with the ecosystem, or they could be internally identified based on best practice as reusable assets. The enterprise architecture team would then maintain the catalog of these standards and ensure compliance and interoperability with financial sector and regulatory ecosystem that we're a part of. We then extend those standards in the preferred building materials that are unique to the Reserve Bank or the specific business units even as preferred capabilities, processes, applications or technologies that should be reused and deployed in the bank. Referencing these standards ensure alignment and conformance to the overall city plan and purpose. So it's an important last element of the city plan. So in summary, the components that make up our city plan analogy would be the purpose, speaking to the mandate and strategy, the city plan itself, the landscape, the baseline and the target with roadmaps, the zoning model for partitioning and the operating model quadrants, our building code or reference architectures with the patterns and guidelines, and finally the building material list made up of architecture standards. So I'm going to delve into a little more detail in some of these, especially some of the newer concepts that we've adopted that you may find useful or interesting to reference. Planning the evolution of the city and using these concepts, you really want to understand where you are, the baseline, and set a target, a visionary objective for the future. And all of the elements in our city plan framework and approach is focused on avoiding building things that don't go anywhere and end up costing a lot of money without significant or value return, and really guide new solutions, new initiatives, transformational activities across the business and IT in the right direction to promote what we see as the preferred end state. So our baseline is typically captured across the different components of the architecture landscape. Similarly, we set a target and we define the future state. And for the South African Reserve Bank, we found it useful to even think about the ecosystem or the extended enterprise because we're not an island of operation. A central bank operates in the financial ecosystem and a regulatory ecosystem. So there's even more than one ecosystem we have to account for and ensure that we fit into it. These perspectives are important when you think about your own organization and the city plan and the ecosystem that they're a part of, the metropolitan area or the extended landscape that they occupy. We would model the purpose and vision of the city using modeling techniques, capture business motivation models, business models, business capabilities, do the assessment of the maturity or the strategic alignment of capabilities to define and test that we are going in the right direction. This is not only a reflection of what the business has defined from a strategic perspective, but may also inform their strategic planning and strategy formulation exercises because it could highlight certain challenges or opportunities. The city plan itself, really the landscape of the baseline and the target, the assessment of the application and technology portfolios that we have, and then the roadmap and the life cycles for change. We capture these and maintain it. It's an ever evolving landscape, so you're never quite done. This is the core of what enterprise architects do. This is what solution architects contribute to and is the primary set of output, leveraging all of the other components. Okay, so the next major element is the zoning model. And the zoning model is made up of two prime components. So the first one is the partitioning of the SARB architecture landscape. Now, the partition model, for those of you familiar with the TOGAF partitioning model, will recognize it to some extent, but we've adapted it as is expected to suit our specific needs. And the partitioning model that is part of our zoning plan provides context and boundaries for the scope of initiatives, and it allows the appropriate decomposition and strategic leveling of initiatives. So in our zoning model, at the top level, we've introduced an extra layer for the extended enterprise and the ecosystem that I referred to just now, really to ensure that we have a perspective on the interaction and collaboration required with external entities. The entire organization, the enterprise, including the subsidiaries, really focused on common and shared infrastructure, those cross-cutting elements of the business. The segment level of the typical TOGAF framework partition model, value streams, the cross-cutting value streams that span departmental boundaries, or portfolios, groupings of elements related to things that have common characteristics or end-to-end service provisioning, core infrastructure around potentially, let's say, business intelligence and analytics across the enterprise, utilized in different ways in different business areas, but following common patterns and products and technologies or skills. And last but not least, the business units, projects, the capabilities, the departmental or divisional scope for execution of individual projects and capabilities. The partitioning model is applied at different levels, and you'll see on the right the adapted version of the TOGAF ADM. It's our SARB architecture development method, just summarizing phase B, C, and D, and then E and F. But really setting the vision, defining the architecture, planning the transition, then governing it and managing any change. We would do that at strategic level, at a portfolio level, or at a project and program level. The next major element is a zoning model or a zoning map, an operating model map. And we started off with referencing seminal work from Gene Ross and Peter Wheel in their book Enterprise Architecture as Strategy, where they refer to this model originally created by MIT Sloan Center for Information System Research. And it really started off talking about the operating model of an entire organization and the different organizations having different levels of process integration or process standardization. And depending on that level of integration or standardization, a business, an organization could fit into either a unification, single way of operating and everything tightly coupled, well integrated model, or an operating model where process integration might be emphasized or more important. So coordinating, let's say, the way in which a Tesla integrates all of their processes from where someone orders a vehicle online through the production process, the delivery and after sales, all around the customer and the product that has been sold. Or replication, good example, the typical McDonald's, anywhere in the world, a Big Mac is a Big Mac. High level of standardization, but a separate outlet, separate customers, so low integration between the different components. Or diversification, where it's a diverse portfolio of products and services, group of individual organizations as part of a group company, diversification. We use this and decided to leverage it by looking at the varying levels of process or data or technology conformity, integration and standardization across the landscape as per their work, but then realized that we could apply this to a business capability perspective, to a technology perspective, and really try to understand how the level of business integration or technology standardization could be consistently applied as a zoning paradigm. And so the operating model for the South African Reserve Bank is actually quite diverse and may find components that are applicable or appropriate in any one of these four quadrants. Core common infrastructure across the bank may require a unified view. And so high level of integration and standardization, the way we manage human resources or finances would be that. So typical run the bank type things, systems of record. But then we have areas where we have to integrate with external parties, and there's a high level of coordination required, or there's a high level of coordination required between different departments, between financial stability and looking at the macro world and the Prudential Authority looking at a micro world. So coordination is required, sharing of information. Conversely, there may be certain practices, how we do risk analysis at a macro level or a micro level, or on exchange control, individual institutions. And we could replicate certain techniques, processes, definitions, tools to support that analysis through a replication model, even though the particular objective and mandate is different. And then, of course, there are certain things that are unique, new developments, innovation, specialized, special purpose mandates, which are individually focused, would require potentially bespoke development, different ways of working, unique skill sets, all of that part of the landscape. So this zoning model allows us to identify where something fits from a strategic perspective or a new initiative or any elements that we require to build towards that. So we build this out and we can identify from a strategic perspective which elements of the strategy fit into, for example, unification, or which business capabilities or processes are more suited in a unified model. The way in which we think about products and services, which are unified and which ones are potentially diversified. Diversification would be more tactical plans, or where do we look at business-led IT, allowing more freedom for the business units and self-service analytics and insight generation, as opposed to corporate defined standards and ways of working. These two models, the partitioning model and the zoning organization model for integration and standardization, even come together in interesting ways, because we could say for the entire organization, the enterprise in the partitioning model typically would look at unification, whereas coordination would usually apply to our value streams, the cross-cutting value streams within the business, or the value streams that touch the ecosystem or the extended enterprise, and how we need to coordinate and collaborate on those levels. Some of that could be replicated in consistent ways of integrating and collaborating with the ecosystem. Replication could also be applicable when we look at certain portfolios or segments of the architecture, the way in which we do BI and analytics across the enterprise, the way in which we manage data across the enterprise. And last but not least, usually some of the diversification would be down at the business unit, project or capability level, where some differentiation is required or unique capabilities are required. And these need to fit together, and the level of application would be determined by the principles that we define across this model. So you'll notice that it's an ongoing balancing act, handling how much diversification, agility, self-service, autonomy we need to provide for, which is often the need from a business perspective, but then goes against potentially some of the unification, coordination of replication objectives that the enterprise may have. How to have a lower total cost of ownership, or how to reuse skills across the enterprise, reducing technical debt, or greater sustainability in the solutions, but may mean delayed gratification for an individual business area or larger upfront effort. So using this partitioning model and zoning plan of ours allows us to decide where we would have controlled divergence and where we want to pursue deliberate convergence, and how to balance and mix that across the enterprise. So we've defined principles. So all architects would define principles to guide the development and the evolution of architecture over time. But now, applying the zoning model, we can appropriately contextualize some of those principles. So things like maximizing benefit to the enterprise definitely makes sense in a unification or even a replication model, and reuse of assets, buying before building, because when it's at an enterprise level, typically systems of record, common systems, foundational systems, they would fit well into the unified model, and you'd be expecting to be able to buy commercial off-the-shelf solutions for that. So high reliance on standards for the enterprise. Coordination, you may think around how to rationalize, standardize, and simplify to enable that coordination, or again, buying before building. Similarly, at the replication level, really focused on standards and reuse. But diversification, you may want to say, well, actually, this is where we do want to have an architecture-led enterprise, but we want to ensure or enable business-led IT decisions, where the guidelines are set, the guardrails are set, but the business has the freedom to innovate and to differentiate for the unique purposes that they require. So customization or bespoke development would fit into this and goes against the typical buy before build or other principles that would be applicable elsewhere. The next component, the building code or reference architectures that we define, those set out the strategic future states without applying it to any particular business area or need. This defines a set of principles, patterns, best practices, approaches for how we believe things should be fit together in order to achieve that long-term strategic direction that we've defined for the city plan. So the building code is an important component, mostly contributed to by our portfolio architects and our domain architects, focused on specific subsets of the architecture landscape and define the best way that we see the future being created. And this becomes the benchmark against which new developments are evaluated and assessed. And our building material list or architecture standards across all of the domains, our preferred capabilities or processes, best ways of doing things, our data landscape, our common data model, our master data and reference data, at an application level, the preferred applications for a certain set of functionality or services, or at a technology level, preferred products for certain capabilities and functionality, or standards and guidelines, whether they're defined externally for interoperability or security purposes, or things that we've decided are most suited for our specific environment internally. These are maintained and kept up to date over time because none of this is static. It constantly evolves and one has to maintain this on an ongoing basis. Our solution architects reference this in defining a unique solution for any of the business needs and initiatives that we get involved in. An example of reusable components, best practice ways of doing things. So it's not just technologies, but also capabilities or processes could be good reference material and defined as a standard. That brings us to the end of the overview of the SARB City Plan. The purpose and vision, defining where the organization is going, what they're about, what we're trying to achieve today and into the future. The city plan itself, the landscape, the baseline and the targets, our zoning model, the partitioning and the operating quadrants that we refer to, our building standards, reference architectures, and finally the building material list, the preferred standards and ways of doing things, all coming together as the core products and services that the enterprise architecture team delivered to our organization, described in a way that might be more consumable for some of our business stakeholders or our families who rarely know exactly what we do and how we go about doing it. Thank you for your interest, and we would love to get some feedback and future ideas on how to evolve even this part of the conversation. Thank you.